Should have marked these out ahead of time. Okay, Luke chapter 7. Let's see. Got to remember the verses here. 1 through 10. Okay, thank you for that. Okay. I should know it. Flipping back and forth between those two passages, I don't know how much. Two little things to think about that have nothing to do with the lesson that I wanted to pass on. How many of you have ever noticed this little gray and white cat that shows up around the church here on Sundays? Okay, and yeah, some of you stop and pet it and everything. Okay, why does that cat show up here every Sunday? You know why that cat is here? Because it finds love here. All right? Have you ever thought about that? What about people? Will people who come to Redlands Community find love here? We hope they do. So be sure, I bring that up because I've been catching a few of Swindoll's messages that play on KJOL, and he was talking about grace. And we should be known as a people of grace. Grace and love. Okay? That's one thought. The other thought, and this is kind of totally random in another way, that I picked up from another preacher, was how at the time when Moses was being used by God to call out the people of Israel from Egypt, okay? During that time, there were a lot of miracles performed through Moses. When you think about all those miracles, the plagues and everything, they all brought death and destruction. Even when they got out into the wilderness wanderings, there were some miracles that brought life, like water from the rock or the quail, the food, the manna, okay? But there are also miracles that brought death and destruction. Over in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, the Apostle Paul refers to the law as the ministry of death. It's the ministry of death. You know, I did a study on that one time, and I found out that as we go through the 10 commandments, you know that 7 of the 10 commandments have the death penalty associated with them if you break them? No wonder Paul calls it the ministry of death. Well, what this preacher was pointing out is that in the miracles of Christ, all of these miracles that we're studying, what did they bring? They brought life. They brought healing, new life, okay, restored life. Isn't that something? That's an amazing contrast when you think about it. And so that kind of leads me into the lesson here today. One other question for you. How many of you, just a little raise of hands here, I'm not taking names or anything, but how many of you have followed the series, The Chosen? Okay, some of you have, okay. Those of you who have followed that series, you know that there's a lot of backstory, okay. There's a lot of stuff that's contrived, okay, that's built around the gospel narratives, okay. I want to give you some backstory today to think about here with these two passages, right? So we're going to start out, and we're going to look first. Well, I'm in Luke, so let's read Luke's account first, okay? When he, that's Jesus, in verse 1, Luke 7, when he had completed all his discourse in the hearing of the people, and the discourse they're referring to is what we call the Sermon on the Mount. So when he did that, he went to Capernaum. And a centurion's slave, who was highly regarded by him, was sick and about to die. When he heard about Jesus, he sent some Jewish elders asking him to come and save the life of his slave. When they came to Jesus, they earnestly implored him, saying, he is worthy for you to grant this to him, for he loves our nation. And it was he who built us our synagogue. Now Jesus started on his way with them, and when he was not far from the house, the centurion sent friends, saying to him, Lord, don't trouble yourself further, for I'm not worthy for you to come under my roof. For this reason I did not even consider myself worthy to come to you. But just say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I also am a man placed under authority with soldiers under me, and I say to this one, go, and he goes, and to another, come, and he comes, and to my slave, do this, and he does it. Now when Jesus heard this, he marveled at him, and turned and said to the crowd that was following him, I say to you, not even in Israel have I found such great faith. And when those who had been sent returned to the house, they found the slave in good health. And by the way, I forgot to mention this, but if anybody didn't get them, there are notes for today's class back there, okay? In fact, no, don't try to go, Jay, okay?
Turn in the chair to get a better angle.
Okay, all right. Then Matthew, let's read the account in Matthew, okay? Starting in verse 5, chapter 8. And when Jesus entered Capernaum, and in the context here, this again, it clearly comes not long after the Sermon on the Mount. A centurion came to him imploring him and saying, Lord, my servant is lying paralyzed at home, fearfully tormented. And Jesus said to him, I will come and heal him. But the centurion said, Lord, I'm not worthy for you to come under my roof, but just say the word and my servant will be healed. For I also am a man under authority with soldiers under me, and I say to this one, go, and he goes, and to another, come, and he comes, and to my slave, do this, and he does it. Now when Jesus heard this, he marveled and said to those who were following, truly I say to you, I have not found such great faith with anyone in Israel. I say to you that many will come from east and west and recline at the table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. But the sons of the kingdom will be cast out into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And Jesus said to the centurion, go, it shall be done for you as you have believed. And the servant was healed that very moment. Okay. All right. Are there, what do you notice about these two passages? Okay, what stands out to you? Where do they agree? Where do they seem to not agree?
Well, the servant was dying or needed help. That was in both scriptures.
Okay, in both passages, it's quite clear that the servant is about to die, okay? Afflicted with some kind of condition. I forget which one it is. I think as Matthew tells us, he's a paralytic, okay? What else?
One thing that stands out to me is that the love of Jesus is extended without regard to distance, so to speak.
Okay, the love of Jesus is extended to that centurion and the one he's interceding for without regard for the distance, okay? Somebody else started to say something? Yeah, Jesus did not have to be present to do the healing, okay? Tom? The humility of the centurion. I think that's a great point, okay? What else? Back here, Zelda.
Well, in one, the centurion comes, and the other, the servant comes.
Okay, yeah. So one of the kind of glaring discrepancies some would say this is a contradiction, okay, is that in the Matthew account, it sounds like Jesus and the centurion meet face to face, right? And in Luke's account, it sounds like they never do. Who does Jesus meet with in Luke's account? With Jews that come and represent the centurion and with friends. Okay? All right. So the question is, are we looking at a contradiction here? And if we are, what do we do with it? All right?
Well, it certainly appears to be a contradiction.
Yes,
I
it
would
does.
argue that both the and the centurion was there, right? The centurion was there, he wasn't left at home. And in Matthew, it makes it sound like it's more the centurion talking, and in Luke, it makes it sound like it's more the elders talking. But I would maintain that they were both there.
That they, meaning,
They meaning the elders that came on his behalf,
okay.
and the centurion
Okay.
accompanied them.
Okay, so Jay is setting forth a proposal here, which is that both the centurion and these Jewish elders are there, and Luke is recording what the Jewish elders are saying on behalf of the centurion. Would that be the idea? Okay, all right.
Otherwise, it was a different situation.
What's that?
Otherwise, it was two different situations.
Otherwise, it might be two different situations. But when you look at the timing, placement in the Gospels, the fact that he's just finished the Sermon on the Mount, both of them say he came down to Capernaum, okay? Most commentators would say this is the same event,
But we know it's not a mistake.
okay? So you can approach this two ways, okay? One is to say there's contradictions in the Bible, and this is one of them. And the other way you can approach this is to say that looks like a contradiction, but maybe we need to understand the rest of the story. Okay? All right. Judy.
Even today, when you get eyewitnesses, they don't agree totally on this timing of everything.
Yeah, eyewitnesses may not agree on everything, even though they witnessed the same event. Perspective, okay? Perspective can make all the difference. All right. So we're going to spend a little time with this. If you have the notes, the first thing I do is I set out what are the similarities, okay? When you look at the similarities between these two accounts, it has to be the same event, okay? So in both accounts, they reference a centurion. Both accounts reference Capernaum is where this occurs. And both the person to be healed is a slave or servant, okay, to the centurion, and is described also as a boy or child. Different Greek words there, okay? In both accounts, the servant is on the verge of death. In both, the centurion pleads for the servant to be healed. In both, Jesus is willing to come to the centurion's home. In both, the centurion says that Jesus does not need to come to his house, recognizing that proximity is not required for the healing. In both, the centurion admits his unworthiness. There's that aspect of humility. In both, Jesus marvels at the centurion's display of faith and admonishes the Jewish crowd that had gathered. In both, that the centurion explains why Jesus, I'm messing that up. Jesus marvels at the centurion's display of faith and admonishes the Jewish crowd that had gathered. Okay? And then the centurion explains why Jesus does not need to come to his home. That happens in both. And finally, in both, the servant is found to be healed and immediately. Okay? Add all that up. Does that sound like the same account? Yeah. Okay. Right. Yeah. I mentioned backstory. Okay? So one of my questions is, where did this centurion get this idea that Jesus could even do that?
Well, he's been doing it.
Jesus has been doing it. So can we make it a valid assumption here, which is that centurion probably didn't live in a news vacuum? Okay? But let me take you over to John, book of John, okay? John chapter 4. And now I got to find my verses here. Verse 43 in John. Now, after the 2 days, he went forth from there into Galilee. For Jesus himself testified that a prophet has no honor in his own country. And when he came to Galilee, the Galileans received him, having seen all the things that he did in Jerusalem at the feast, for they themselves also went to the feast. Therefore he came again to Cana of Galilee, where he had made the water wine. and there was a royal official whose son was sick at Capernaum. When he heard that Jesus had come out of Judea into Galilee, he went to him and was imploring him to come down and heal his son, for he was at the point of death. So Jesus said to him, "Unless you people see signs and wonders, you simply will not believe." The royal official said to him, "Sir, come down before my child dies." Jesus is saying to him, "Go, your son lives." The man believed the word that Jesus spoke to him and started off. As he was now going down, his slaves met him, saying that his son was living. So he inquired of them the hour when he began to get better. And then they said to him, "Yesterday at the 7th hour, the fever left him." So the father knew that it was at that hour in which Jesus said to him, "Your son lives," and he himself believed, and his whole household. This is again a second sign that Jesus performed when he had come out of Judea into Galilee. Okay? Now, is this the same event from yet a third perspective, or is this different? Why is it different? Okay, this time it's a son, not a servant. Okay? Okay, guy comes directly to Jesus and asks him, Jay?
Yeah, he was a royal official, which leads me to believe he was either, an Israelite or, part of Herod's crew.
Okay, he's a royal official instead of a centurion. Okay? And really, if you look at this in the preceding context, this event doesn't seem to follow on the heels of the Sermon on the Mount. That's not even mentioned here. It actually follows on Jesus having been in Jerusalem. Okay? So, can I propose a little backstory here? All right? The backstory is that basically the healing takes place in Capernaum, where is the centurion station. Capernaum. Okay? Remember I said something about, does he live in a news vacuum? No. He's a centurion. His job is to keep order in the city. All right? He should know what's going on. This is where maybe the chosen is kind of getting it right. Because they have a centurion figure there he's under Roman authority, okay, but it is his job to keep order in the city, right? That's what a centurion is supposed to do. Now, throw in another interesting link here. Royal official. What's a royal official? What does that imply? Probably implies that we're talking about someone who is part of the court of Herod Antipas. Okay, he's an official in the court of Herod Antipas. Right? That makes him an official within this geographic area. All right? The centurion, all right, some commentators assumed he was a Roman centurion, but Herod Antipas also kept forces stationed throughout Israel. Herod Antipas, by the way, is the Herod that had John the Baptist beheaded. All right? Those of you following the chosen, that's the Herod that was in charge then, okay? All right, so what I'm driving at here is that the centurion may not be a Roman centurion. There's also the possibility that he's a centurion under Herod Antipas, because Antipas is under ultimately Roman authority, and the forces assigned to Antipas were organized much like the Romans would have. So the same title belonged to this man here. If that's the case, okay, possibility here, if that's the case, then it's quite possible that this royal official and this centurion may have known each other. Or if they didn't know each other, certainly the news about what Jesus did for that royal official and his son got to this centurion. Does that make sense to you? There's some interesting backstory there, okay? And I think, I don't intend this as a criticism of Dallas Jenkins, but if you want backstory, I think Scripture gives us a possible backstory here, okay? All right, differences. What are the differences here? In Matthew, it appears that Jesus converses directly with the centurion and meets with him, while in Luke, emissaries are sent that include prominent Jews or elders and close friends or associates. In Luke chapter 7, starting in the last half of verse 6, and in verses 7 and 8, the friends, in fact, take a careful look at your Bible version, okay? Starting about halfway through verse 6, the friends go to Jesus, saying to him, Lord, do not trouble yourself further. In my version, that is in quotation marks. And that quotation continues through verse 8. Who are they quoting? They're quoting the centurion, okay? The centurion told them what to say to Jesus. And they faithfully report that. They quote the centurion. And in fact, if you're going back at this time here, if you're going to be a messenger for somebody, you better get it right. They didn't have cell phones, they didn't have radio, they didn't have TV. These things weren't written down. If you're a messenger, you must get it right. Okay? And they do. So I think that kind of throws something out there that helps us reconcile here what's going on. Another difference we see between Matthew and Luke is that in Matthew, there is much more recorded regarding what Jesus said to the others that had been following. In fact, he gives quite an admonishment, doesn't he? He admonishes that Jewish crowd that was witnessing or overhearing what was going on. He admonishes them and warns them, okay? There'll be many, east and west, whatever, that'll come and be a part of the kingdom that's going to be established. But the sons of the kingdom, the ones who think they're entitled to it, you may find yourself cast into outer darkness. What does that imply? No part in the kingdom. All right? So Matthew records that, but Luke leaves that out. Now, let's talk a little bit about why does Matthew record that part and Luke leave that part out? Who did Matthew write his gospel to and for? For the Jews, okay? So wouldn't it make sense that an admonishment like this that Jesus gives that's intended for the Jews to hear, that Matthew would include this? But Luke, on the other hand, he writes this gospel basically for whom? Gentiles, okay? So Luke doesn't feel the necessity of putting in that part, okay? Selection or being selective with material in itself does not comprise a contradiction. You got that? Each of these authors being selective does not necessarily constitute a contradiction. They're picking out the material that's best suited for the audience to whom they are writing. Okay? That right there helps reconcile a lot of this. Okay? So, how are we doing here? So, giving you the backstory, and we've talked, so I've given you basically the author's motivations here. That's kind of at the bottom of the page, and then we move over onto the back. Luke's more interested in a gospel account that relates Jesus to the Gentiles. So in his account, he provides more precise detail regarding the encounter, the dynamic that goes on between the centurion, the Jewish representatives, his friends, and Jesus. That's what he focuses on. Why does he do that? Because he wants the Gentiles to whom his letter is intended, his gospel is intended, he wants them to understand the accessibility of Jesus to them, to the Gentiles. Okay? So, and going on from there, for Gentiles, this would be more necessary explanation because they would need to understand better the relationship that existed between Jews and Gentiles in Israel at that time, especially Gentiles that lived outside of Palestine, which is most of the rest of the world. Okay? This is that dynamic between Jew and Gentile that existed in Israel is something most of them wouldn't get unless somebody explained it to them. Okay? And part of that dynamic was that the Jews in general, okay, as believing that they are sons of the kingdom, chosen of God, a chosen nation, through that they believed themselves to be superior to the Gentiles. To enter a Gentile home was against, not technically against the law, the Torah, okay, but it was against the traditions of the rabbis, the Pharisees, etc. Okay, that was to defile yourself. Okay, and here Jesus is saying, I'm ready to come into your house. And the centurion, I think, recognizing that could bring discredit to Jesus, is humble enough to say to Jesus, you don't need to come into my house. I don't want to put you in that position. So that centurion is being very considerate, isn't he? Because he lives with those Jewish people. He knows about all of this. Is the scene starting to come together for you? Okay. So, the last things I want to read here. In the Lucan account, the sending of intermediaries, first the Jews who plead the merits of the centurion, and then the friends who convey the desires of the centurion. That conveys respect for Jesus as a Jew whom they knew would be prohibited from entering a Gentile home. In addition, by using such intermediaries and avoiding a face-to-face meeting, you did not place the important person, who would be Jesus, on the spot. That would be impolite, okay? And you minimize shame for yourself if the request is denied. You see that? Okay. Secondly, by sending persons more acceptable than yourself, as a Gentile, the centurion would have been looked upon or looked down upon by the Jews. Remember that. You increase your chances of a favorable response, right? Send somebody who relates better to Jesus than this centurion. That's what he does, okay? So I think Luke's account is spot on, okay? Luke gives us accurate detail here. Why does Matthew not give us all that detail? Well, keep going. Another point to consider regarding the apparent contradictions is that the leaving out of certain details by one author doesn't necessarily constitute a contradiction, okay? Already made that point. So how do we reconcile the two passages? The Jesus and the centurion meet face to face. Most likely, I think they did not, as represented by Luke, but Matthew chooses to leave out those details because he regards them as irrelevant to his presentation, or possibly that some aspects like the sending of the emissaries and representatives would be assumed by the readers. That's how they operated in that culture, okay? But one of the examples of that is Matthew 27:26, okay? Don't have time to go over that in detail, but if you go to that, that's where it talks about Pilate having Jesus scourged, okay? All right? If you read the literal Greek text there, the Greek text makes it sound like Pilate did it himself, okay? If you look at most all of your English versions out there today, most all of them make it sound like Pilate had some of his soldiers do it. Okay, why is that? Because more than likely, Pilate didn't actually administer the scourging himself, even though the Greek text kind of makes it look like that. All right, but it's understood in the culture, Pilate's the guy who gives the orders, the soldiers carry him out. And that's exactly what we have here. Okay? And so Matthew is writing in a context where people would understand that. And that's who he's writing to. I list one other possibility here. A third possibility is that both Matthew and Luke got their material directly from this centurion. Where did Matthew and Luke come up with the quotation? What's to say that they could not have gotten it from this actual centurion? He could still be alive. Okay? And so that centurion, he's quoting himself. And he's conveying, this is what I told these emissaries to say to Jesus. So there's no contradiction, really. It's just a matter of perspective here. Okay? And I think there are more than one ways in which we can reconcile all of this. Right? Sorry to kind of rush through that. Real quick, one or two questions or response here. Yes, Jake.
I don't know what the meaning of it all is, but it's very interesting how most of the time God heals, or Jesus healed people the way that they wanted them healed. You know, for example, the centurion, Jesus didn't have to go there. He just said, well, but he was on his way to go to the centurion when he said he wasn't worthy, because that's what Jesus appeared man wanted. And then you say the woman that was bleeding, well, if I only could touch his clothes, and, you know, if you would have only been here, you know, it just seems like Jesus healed people the way they wanted to be.
Jesus is accommodating.
He's accommodating. He could have, a lot of more miracles, he could have just done the same way. Well, okay, he's healed, go on your way. He didn't do it that way.
Yeah. Yeah, it is interesting, Jake, to observe all the various ways in which he healed. And maybe that's part of what we'll get out of this study. I got to close with just a couple of thoughts here. One of the applications I get out of this passage is the value of intercessory prayer. Do you see that here? The centurion is interceding for the slave. Right? Now, we're thinking, oh, Jesus is on earth. You know, this is not prayer, but it is prayer. Okay? And it's an example of intercessory prayer and the value of that. And then the second thing, the healing, when Jesus heals, is not based on or dependent on the faith or the merit of the one being healed or on the one making the request, though the Jewish elders may think so. Okay? So what I want you to see there is all by grace. Okay? Jesus doesn't do this because anybody deserves it. He does it based on love. He does it based on grace. And, you know, and if we ever start thinking that we can do something to merit God to do something for us, that we could put God in our debt, okay, we're thinking wrong. That's not grace. That's works. Be careful with that. All right. Let's close in prayer. Father, thanks again for the powerful testimony of your word, for the mercy and grace that is shown here by Jesus to this centurion, this one who typically would have been despised and hated by the Jews. And yet Jesus approaches him with the love and grace we've mentioned here today. Thank you for this account. May we learn from it. May we grow in our lives because of what we have seen today. In Jesus' name, amen. Yes. And he doesn't have to be here, right? Being there in heaven is just as good as being here.